Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Pho, founder and editor of KevinMD. Today in the show, we have Stephanie Wellington. She is a neonatologist and physician coach. She wrote the KevinMD article, Medicine's Contribution to My Family. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for having me.
So get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. So like many physicians, I began my journey in medicine with that decision. And why that's so important is because that decision was made long before I really knew what medicine was all about. I knew I wanted to help people, make a positive impact in the world. And that was the way that I saw that I would be able to accomplish that. So, I went through the traditional route, undergrad, medical school, and then on through training. And I didn't realize that the impact that this journey was going to have on me. I think medicine is great at really training us in terms of becoming great clinicians and physicians, but there's also another side to medicine that is shaping us and changing us that we really aren't prepared for. So it became ever more glaring for me when I made the decision to go into neonatal medicine. And while I love the babies, the procedures, what I really wasn't prepared for was doing that prenatal consult with a young family whose baby was on the cusp of viability, and having that conversation with them about what their goals and expectations were and what we could do in medicine, what the limitations were for a 22, 23, 24-weeker, and how to have the two come together, merge, and coexist. I wasn't fully prepared for those times in the middle of the night when I had to call a family and let them know that their baby had taken a turn for the worse. And inviting them to come and sit at the bedside and just wait to see what was going to happen. Would the baby respond to our medical interventions, or would the baby pass away? And I wasn't prepared for sitting with the family should the baby not make it. And while I knew from a medical standpoint all the things to do, there was a toll that it was taking on me as I had to make sense of and figure out how does this other part, this human side of medicine, integrate so that I could continue to work from one patient to the next patient without really taking time to process it all. I often remember thinking the families had the opportunity to mourn, to grieve. And as clinicians, we just have to move on to the next patient. And so through the journey, I realized that while the career was progressing, the outward display of success was showing up for me, internally something was just missing. And I remember driving in the highway one day and thinking to myself, this couldn't be all that there is, because I'm not feeling fulfilled at all in medicine. And so on that journey, that's what took me to life coaching, because as I was looking for some answer, and I looked to my preceptors and I looked to my mentors, they seemed to be able to move through this process. They offered things like not being too attached and detached involvement. And while that worked for some period of time, it really wasn't the answer for me. And so when I found life coaching and really began to live from those new principles and tenets, it became inspirational. It became motivational and spiritual. And it allowed me to show up in medicine in a very different way. It allowed me to partner with the families. It allowed me to partner with the colleagues and not feel as if I was losing so much of myself as I was practicing medicine. So that's how I came to merge coaching and medicine on my journey.
Now, how long were you practicing before you discovered that life coaching can address some of the issues that you described?
I think it was probably about 10 years in. Probably about 10 years in.
And tell me a little about your practice now and how that intersects with life coaching.
So initially when I started life coaching, I actually was working with family. So I did the work for myself, and then I realized and recognized that the same principles that I was using would actually benefit many of the families in the unit. So, we'd have families who were never expecting to have a premature baby or expecting their baby to come to the NICU. They were expecting to have a normal delivery, go home after, 48 hours with their baby and continue on with their life. They had planned it that way. And the detour into the NICU actually became a dream interrupted. And so my initial experiences with life coaching really were with coaching moms and dads in the neonatal ICU. I was able to facilitate the parent support group in the unit that I was working in at the time, and really give them tools and strategies to learn how to navigate medicine. One of the biggest things that I used to work with families about is how to incorporate the online information that they're getting with their actual experiences, because there's so much information online for anything in medicine, but particularly in terms of the neonatal ICU, but not everything would necessarily apply to you. And so do you go in and jump in and consume all this information and just elevate your level of stress and worry? Mm-hmm. Or do you, I would invite them to bring the information back to the bedside. What's relevant, keep. What's not relevant, discard, so that it empowers you to get more information, know what questions to ask the clinicians without sending you over the top in terms of stress and just overwhelm. And so that's really where it began. And then as I began to work with the families, I realized that the families are becoming more proactive and empowered. But then here we are as clinicians kind of still sitting on the sidelines with more of a paternalistic view in terms of our interactions. And so it kind of segued into, how do we work together in more of a partnership way? And so that's where coaching physicians came in. The other way coaching physicians came in was we all have a story. We pick up evidence along the way based on, even from as early as medical school and residency, based on our experiences. And I find that, myself included, a lot of physicians, those stories that we've picked up either contribute to our success or take away from our success. And it doesn't mean that we're not successful in moving forward, but it's kind of what we internalize. So for me, my story was that I have to work very hard and I'm always tired. And so every decision that I made, it was like, oh, I'm willing to do this, but it was a sacrifice. And so using coaching, it allowed me to begin to shift. And in the article that you mentioned, I mentioned that as well. It allowed me to shift the perspective so that, if I decided to do an extra shift, it would benefit me and my family versus taking away from time with my family. And so where I am now in terms of the coaching physicians is really working on how do we learn to partner with medicine in a way that's life affirming, in a way that allows us to enjoy the process rather than feeling like it's an experience of struggle and stress.
So let's talk about that KevinMD article that you wrote. It's titled Medicine's Contribution to My Family. Now, for those who didn't read the article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
So I actually started a series in my Facebook group about love notes to medicine. It was the month of February. We're in the middle of a pandemic where, there's so much upheaval in just life in general, in the world in general, and in medicine, that I thought about, there are things about medicine that have really been a blessing to my life, a blessing to my family. And so I started this series. And so out of that came this article that really talked about the fact that in the beginning of my career, I remember the first time my son rolled over. I was in the emergency room picking up a baby who's being transported to the hospital where I was working. And, the immediate reaction was like, oh, I'm missing out on a huge event in his life. And so it felt like I'm giving to medicine, but it's taking away from me personally and in terms of my family life. And as I moved through the beginning parts of my career, I actually had two children in fellowship, one in the beginning and one towards the end of fellowship. There was always that dance I was playing between, them or medicine. Luckily, I had family members, the grandparents who took care of them, so I didn't have to worry about childcare. But it did make me feel like it was always a balancing act. And so in the article, it's more of a reflection, I guess, but I came to a place where I began to understand that it wasn't a balancing act. And when I chose medicine, it was still choosing my family. It was still allowing me to provide for my family. It was allowing me to demonstrate the values that, they now can pick up and use as they move on into their young adulthood and thinking about their careers. Things like being of service, things like, caring for others. And as I actually even look back over their school careers, there were instances where I could see where they decided on activities and things that demonstrated those same principles. My son actually spent some time doing Taekwondo, and now he's doing another martial arts. And when I think about it, he told me the value in that is it allows him to de-stress. So
Hmm.
he's learning the importance of well-being as he thinks about his long-term career. He's going into finance, which can be very stressful. So he's putting in place already things to really support his life. And I'm going to contribute some of that to medicine. He saw me work very hard. He saw there were times when we put in long hours, but there was also the importance of taking a break, importance of recovering and restoring. And so I think that what initially for me looked like sacrifice, it really was a blending and a merging of the two.
Wonderful. I love how you frame that in terms of rather than what medicine takes away from your family, but you're framing that as how medicine contributes to your family and is shaping your children's lives.
Yes, and I think that's very important. Neither one are going into medicine, and that's fine. But I think that for me, making that shift, it really, when I look back at it and I look at the journey overall, I say to myself, I wish I could have made that shift so much earlier, so that I would have appreciated it so much earlier. But the fact that it came when it came is just the way it is.
So actually, that leads me to my next question. So if you were to do this all over again and have a
Mhm.
family during fellowship training, is there anything that you would have done differently?
I would probably have still done the fellowship. I think my perspective would have been a little different. I think that I would have sought to achieve a little bit more balance. I did fellowship almost 20 plus years ago. And so the way the fellowship training schedule was designed was a little different than how things are now. And so people now, I think a little bit easier today to be able to have family and do a lot of other things that you might want to do because of the schedule. Whereas my schedule back then was very demanding,
Hmm.
but I would still do it the same way in terms of like my timing of having my family and children. I would do it the same way. I have no regrets about that.
So that intersection between medicine and family always has been a little bit of a tension to most
Hmm.
physicians. Now,
Hmm.
from your own experience or through the experience of your physician clients, what are some tips that you could offer for those physicians who struggle balancing medicine and family?
One of the first tips that I learned as I began to incorporate coaching into medicine was I needed to have an off switch.
Hmm.
Because what I found was if I had a very stressful day, I would then bring that home, and then that would overflow into my personal life and my family life. And so one of the things that I did was I'd pick a point on my commute home. And at that point, usually the midway point in New York, it's traveling over a bridge. So I would travel over a certain bridge, and medicine now was shut and my family life was open. And so when I learned to do that, it gave me that time to decompress from the adrenaline and the stress and the high intensity of being in the unit. And then it began, okay, from this point on, it was about my family life. And so whether I changed the music in the radio or just shift my thoughts to, planning the family dinner. And I did my best to not have the two merge so much. One of the other things that worked well for me was when I shifted from being an attending carrying a pager at home to being a hospitalist,
Hmm.
because as a hospitalist, when my shift ended, my shift ended. And when I worked as an attending, especially when my children were very young, I could be home fielding questions. And sometimes that meant I had to go in and I had to disrupt whatever we were doing at home in order to go into the hospital. So really creating clearer guidelines, and it didn't always work,
Hmm.
but making the effort to create clearer guidelines really benefited me in terms of finding some balance between the two. I tend to work more nights and weekends, so I was able to be the at-home mom, so I could participate in the school activities, which was really great. And the energy and the joy that I got from that allowed me to then, when I transitioned over to work, those were the feeling and memories that I could keep with me, so
Hmm.
that when I was doing a 24-hour shift and it was stressful, it didn't just totally have me drained and bottom out, because I found some balance between the two.
We're talking to Stephanie Wellington. She's a neonatologist and physician coach. She wrote the Kevin MD article, Medicine's Contribution to My Family. Stephanie, I talked to a lot of physicians who are
Mhm.
interested in becoming coaches as well
Mhm.
for similar reasons to what you described. If those physicians are interested in making such a transition, what are some tips that you could recommend to them?
Two things. One thing is that the most important transition that I made was incorporating the practices of life coaching into my life, so
Hmm.
that it became not something that I'm just, teaching others about, but it's something that I was living. And that really allowed me to see the benefit and to understand its true value, so that as I coach other physicians, I'm able to, teach from example and not just from theory. And then the other piece is that there's also the building out the coaching practice, and that takes a different skill set. And like you said, it is somewhat time consuming. So understanding that there'll be that period of time when you're dancing between the two and making, maybe even overcommitting some of your time at times to
Hmm.
be able to do, if you're still, like for me, I'm still in clinical practice and doing the coaching as well.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
My take home message is, what I think about my take home message? My take home message is going to be that I think medicine is still a great career. I champion that practicing physician, the clinician. That's who I love to work with, the person who is still in practice at the bedside and who wants support. And so my take home message is that I think medicine is still a really great career. And I think that with the right tools and strategies and support, we can continue to live through and move through this career and do well in it. I don't think it's something that, we see a lot of people talking about exiting medicine. And I don't think that being a clinician is something that we have to exit. I think it's the opportunity for us to grow personally, spiritually, emotionally, so that we continue to benefit from that initial decision of being a doctor.
Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.